Here's what we learned using Pact for contract testing. Pact is a code-first consumer-driven contract testing tool. What do I mean by that? Let's say I'm building an Android application and I have an API client class, which is the one which invokes the API provider, which in this case will be a backend for front-end service. Now, as the name suggests for the approach, this is a code-first approach, right? So which means I need to write the code and I also need to write the unit test for the API client class. Now, the API client class depends on the API provider, which at this point we'd have to mock using Pact DSL. This is the first problem that we encountered because our developers now had to learn the Pact DSL in order to define the BFF mock. Now, let's say we got past that problem and we defined the BFF API mock. What happens next? As a result of unit tests hitting the API client class, the API client class would interact with the BFF API mock, and that would result in the Pact JSON being generated. Now, where do we put the Pact JSON? That would be the Pact Broker. This is problem number 2. The Pact Broker is an independent server that we need to track. The broker is the central piece through which all the Pact JSONs are orchestrated. Now, the problem is who would maintain the broker, who would make sure that it is running. Considering the broker is in the critical path, if should the broker go down, it would impact our ability to run our CI pipelines and block features from going out. Now, let's say we somehow handle that problem and keep the broker up. What's next? The Pact JSON is used to run the contract test against the provider, which in this case is the backend for front-end application. Now, the contract for the backend for front-end is not completely defined by one consumer. It may have multiple consumers. In our use case, we also had like an iOS application, which would also generate its version of the Pact JSON based on what it expects the backend for frontend to behave like. So thereby, the contracts for the backend for frontend happens to be a cumulative effect of all the Pact JSONs coming from individual consumers. Now, in the backend for frontend application, we would have various layers. Again, we have the controller, the service layer, the API client class. Now, here the API client class will talk to the backend for frontend's dependency, which happens to be domain services. Now, I'm guessing you already have come to the conclusion as to what we'll need here. We need a domain API mock, which again we will use Pact DSL to define. As a result of the unit tests we write for the API client class, it would invoke the domain API mock, and the interactions between the API client class and the domain API mock would result in a Pact JSON that is generated by the backend for front-end application. Now, this should already be giving you a rough overview of where this is going, right? So let's say I have a feature which I have to build all the way from the app to the backend for front-end to the domain service, and that needs to call a third party. Let's look at how that journey looks. First, I will need to build the the app itself because it's a consumer-driven contract, right? So the first consumer comes into picture. And after that, consumer has generated its Pact JSON for the backend for front-end application. That is run as a contract test against the BFFs. And now you can start building out the BFFs. And again, in the BFFs, you have defined the mock for the domain API. And as a result of your unit tests running there, that would result in the Pact JSON, which is generated for the domain service. Now you can start building the domain service, use the Pact JSON to run as contract test. Now, domain service, again, depends on the third-party service. I need to mock that using, Pact DSL again and generate a Pact JSON. Now, at least so far, all this contract testing and Pact usage was within the organization, and Pact is something that we can say we'll all adhere to. But here's where our bigger problem came in, which is now third-party interfaces and services is not something that's completely in our control. We cannot completely force them to say, hey, use this Pact JSON to run contract tests against your services. So thereby, even using the mock really doesn't make sense in this case. But nevertheless, let's assume we somehow convince the third party, which is very, very unlikely. And then the third party could start building the application. There's an additional aspect and a bigger problem that we have. Our teams are already using OpenAPI specification and uploading those to internal developer portals as a reference, as living documentation for each of the services. And third-party applications also expose OpenAPI specification because it's widely accepted. Now, when we have to adopt Pact, we have to additionally maintain Pact JSON, which is an additional artifact. And some of the information in the OpenAPI and Pact JSON are essentially different representations of the same details. And that results in duplication and multiple sources of truth, which is a very big problem in our opinion. Now, considering all of these difficulties, the steep learning curve of learning the TSL, and then the impracticality of the sequential development style, and ultimately the fact that we have to deal with multiple sources of the same information, Pact did not really work out for us.